You've probably figured out by now that I don't shy away from reading books that are heavy going. And some of the best discoveries I've made for my art and for my edification in general are because I push myself a little bit. I do, however, shy away from recommending some of the heavier works that I come across because I don't always know if they're going to be received in the same spirit that I read them. Now, the book that I'm going to be talking about today is heavy going. I won't shy away from that, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be worth it for anyone who's curious about adding a level to their science fiction and fantasy world building. This is something of a follow-up to my earlier discussion of another book, Stephen Jay Gould's Mismeasure of Man, because it touches on many of the same themes. What is human nature? What is human culture? How do those things influence each other? And the book I'm talking about today is called The Dark Matter of the Mind by Daniel L. Everett. And his thesis for this is that it is not in our nature to do any one particular thing, like make art or use tools or even create language. What is innate in our nature is our flexibility, our adaptability, our capacity for offloading things from what would normally be our genetic heritage into our cultural heritage. We can store knowledge outside of ourselves, and we can transmit it across generations through culture, instead of having to make it part of our biology. And one of the advantages of this is that it gives us better odds of survival as a species. So, in Everett's own words, and this can give you an idea for how hefty a read this book is, dark matter of the mind is any knowledge how or any knowledge that is unspoken in normal circumstances, usually unarticulated even to ourselves. In other words, it's not something that we may be aware of at any moment, but we live inside of it and we're shaped by it. It may be, but is not necessarily ineffable. It emerges from acting, languaging, and culturing as we learn conventions and knowledge organization and adopt value properties and orderings. It is shared and it is personal. Now, this should give you some idea of what level he's operating under. As for his background, his ideas about all of these things arose from his experiences with a tribe in the Amazon called the Piraha, and Everett originally came to them as a missionary, and he eventually abandoned that, but returned to them as a researcher, as a linguist, and as an anthropologist. And some of why he changed tracks was because he had grave doubts about his own belief, and also because he discovered that it was really hard to actually be a missionary to these people. We had a society here that had no concept of an afterlife, no concept of any higher beings. So it was virtually impossible to proselytize to them in the first place. There were also many parts of language that they didn't share with us. For instance, they had no concept in their language of a subjunctive mode, of the ability to state a hypothetical via a grammatical construction. So what Everett took away from all of this and through his subsequent work is the idea that the mind is not culture by itself. The mind is in culture. Culture is something that exists above and outside any one of us, but it gives rise to us as we're born in it and as it shapes us. And again, the classic example that he uses is the discussion of language. Language is not something that we have an instinct for. It's an expression of our overall flexibility as an organism. It's something that we were able to develop like a tool. And the language as instinct idea has had a lot of popularity in previous decades. The idea that there was this thing dormant within all of us that had the capacity to create language. The instinct made good by learning, as Norbert Wiener put it in his discussions of cybernetics. But Everett's argument is that there isn't any such thing. There's no instinct for language waiting to be activated. Instead, it's one of many possible things that arises from this pool of biological capacity that we have. So the takeaway is that we may well have other things that are possible to us culturally that we just haven't discovered or nurtured yet or figured out how to tease out. But getting there wouldn't be easy. So it would help to expand as much as we can the range of our cultural experiences, the breadth of our cultural knowledge, the depth of our cultural understanding as a prelude to all of that. One of the other things Everett takes away from this is a concept of the self that seems to be very reminiscent of the concept of the self in Buddhism, the idea that it is an aggregate. It's not this atomic thing. It's not something that is irreducible. It's the product of many different things, and it's a process all of its own. And I think one of the things that really heartened me about the way he talks about these things in the book is that he's arguing out of all of these things out of a sense of how to be more humane. He's not arguing out of some chic sense of nihilism about human beings, the idea that we're nothing but a process. He's not trying to reduce us to a mere equation. He's trying to understand that we are a lot more fluid than we give ourselves credit for. Now, as you can guess, a lot of the book is pretty thorny going for people who don't have a background in linguistics. There's a lot of terminology, but he does explain as he goes, so it rewards slower and more careful reading. So you probably want to set aside a couple of weeks at least to dive into the book. Now, the way all of this relates to science fiction and fantasy, I've always been fascinated with science fiction and fantasy stories that explore the idea of what is human nature, or the idea of what any species constitution really is, whether it's a biological species or an artificial species, something that we created ourselves. I've always also been fascinated with stories that revolve around ideas around language, how we develop it, how we use it, how it evolves, and how those things are embedded in our culture and are not always obvious to us unless we sit down and do the work necessary to study. And finally, we have stories about directed evolution of culture. Most of you probably know Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, which is one example of this sort of thing. It brings up the question of whether it's possible for cultural evolution to be consciously directed towards a particular goal. Or is that something out of our reach to construct in a deliberate way? Can we actually plan a future for our species that is larger than anything we can think of right now? And just because we have a theory about how we might be a culture, does that give us the tools to create a synthetic future culture for our future selves to inhabit, one that's more in line with what we think we need? Do we even have the right to do that? And I don't think those are questions that you're going to be able to answer in any definitive way. I think the whole point is that every time we sit down with a big question like that, we want to grapple with it in a different way. We want to grapple with it with the cultural and sociological perspective that we have at our moment in time, because that's the only way that we can give it any real perspective. We may get a different answer in 50 years, but that's the point. It's to see how each time we sit down with a question, we come up with a different answer to it. So I do think that anyone with even a passing interest in the ideas that I've sketched above and how they can enrich science fiction and fantasy stories should give this book a shot. Again, it's not easy reading, but it is very absorbing, and it gives you a lot of raw material in the form of Everett's own experiences with the Pirahã tribe and his own theories about them to grapple with. And once again, the book is called The Dark Matter of the Mind by Daniel L. Everett. It is available digitally and in print. And while it's probably a lot tougher than some of the other stuff I've recommended here, I absolutely encourage you to give it a shot and see what you think.